This is our only chance. We have to take it. We need our kitty. The world needs her to stop what's coming.
It's Godzilla.
Nobody gon' stop me. Here we go. Here we go.
Boker Tov, Talmidim, and welcome to yet another edition of Soulful Psalms. It's a peculiar one, as you might have noticed from the clip that began, where we start with Godzilla versus Owl Kitty. I'll explain in a moment. But before we get to that, I want to talk about an interesting feature that we're about to transition through. At the end of, I already said that Psalms from 63 on are kind of boring. So we're going to pick up again at Psalm 74. But before we get there, at the end of Psalm 72 in verse 20, there is an interesting declaration. It says, "Here ends the Psalms of David, son of Jesse." What? At 72, David is done? Of course, I've told you before that the attribution of the Psalms to David is probably apocryphal, probably not correct. But in any case, what's interesting here is that it seems to suggest that there was a time 2,500 years ago, 2,200 years ago, when there were only 72 Psalms and they were all attributed to King David. And supposedly everything that follows afterwards is not King David. So we had a 72 Psalm collection, and then we started adding stuff. And in fact, you can see that. You can see that next 11 Psalms are credited to a Levite named Asaph, or to the school of composers of a Levite named Asaph, or to the children of a Levite named Asaph. So many questions we cannot answer. But apparently there is this tradition of Asaph and or his relatives and or his disciples composing more psalms. Now, the name Asaph itself is quite interesting. It is very close and cognate to Yosef, that is Joseph. And in fact, it may be that it's exactly the same name. It's not spelled exactly the same, but people didn't have dictionaries back then. So they would spell a word the way it sounded when it was pronounced. So maybe in one part of ancient Israel, everyone said Yosef, and in another part of ancient Israel, people would say Asaph, just in the same way that people in the South would say Yehoshua, and people in the North would say Hosea. And it's the same name, but it's spelled differently, it's pronounced differently because of regional dialects. Anyway, that being neither here nor there, now we get 11 Psalms of Asaph, and we think we're all done with King David Psalms, but in fact, there's another half dozen Psalms above 72 ascribed to David. So clearly people kept adding stuff onto the back end of this collection. And we do not know exactly when this process started, but as I've said before, 900 to 1,000 year window for the composition of all the books of the Bible. And some of them probably received additional materials over time. And clearly that's what's going on with the Psalms. So just to call your attention to that. All right, so let's go to Psalm 74. It's a long psalm, and it starts out with your classic we're being oppressed. It's actually in the collective. It's not I'm being oppressed by enemies, we're being oppressed by enemies. And since there is a reference to the ruin of the temple, there's a good reason to think that this psalm was composed after the destruction of the temple. It has some interesting literary features. It actually has what's called a chiastic structure, in the sense that you do x y y x x x y y y y x x, and you create these sort of cross hatching of ideas, terms, and linguistic forms to create structure. And that is definitely there. And interestingly enough, this is fairly unique. It's done through the verbs, which is impossible to imitate in English. So, and what it's doing is it's alternating between imperfect and perfect verbs through at least the first half of the poem. Very clever. You could hear it and recognize it in Hebrew. You can't replicate it in English. And so I just want you to be aware of that. It's an interesting feature. But what I want to talk about is from verse 12 to verse 17. All right. Now, this brings us to Godzilla, and I'll explain. So, in the ancient Near East, there's a lot of different ways that people imagined how the world was created, or how the universe was created, or how the cosmos, let's use the word cosmos, was created. And Genesis 1 is pretty unique in has God speak the world into existence through a speech acts. Let there be light, and there was light, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's interesting. And I might also connect it to the idea of B'Tselem Elohim, in the image of God. Maybe the author of Genesis imagined the image of God being that we speak like God does, that we have this capacity for complex communication. Our ancestors did not understand as we do that there are scales of communication and speech in animals. Virtually all animals communicate in some way, some of them rather sophisticated ways, but nothing to compare to what we're doing. So our ancestors imagined, well, the only creature that God created that shares in the capacity to speak and therefore create in a serious way is us. And so that's the divine image. That's one theory. I think it's a good one, but it doesn't have to be the only one. We also talk about having moral judgment, having freedom, all these different things. The one thing we don't talk about is that we have 10 fingers. Therefore, God must have 10 fingers. That's not part of the image of God as far as we're concerned. But in any case, Genesis, speech acts, but there are other traditions throughout the ancient Near East. There's the cosmic egg, or a little more directly analogous to human beings, that a god and a goddess copulate, and their generativity produces the cosmos. So, imitatio hominem, the gods imitate human beings, creating life through sex. There's a super weird one in the Egyptian tradition where a god autoerotically creates the cosmos by masturbating. We won't get into it, but I want you to know it's there. We also have the tradition of theomachy, which is what I want to talk about and why Godzilla is relevant. Theomachy is a fancy word for divine conflict or divine combat. And throughout the ancient Near East, this was a very prominent idea that the cosmos was created because new gods rise up against old gods and they fight. And out of that conflict, the cosmos is created. We can immediately think of Greek mythology with Zeus overthrowing the Titans, right? And taking control of heaven. In ancient Near East, it's usually in this form. It is in the form of a new god arising, Marduk in Mesopotamia, and Baal in Canaanite tradition, and that they battle the archaic god, which is in the form a chaos monster, and it's usually a sea monster, right? It's Prince Yam or the Prince Sea in the Canaanite tradition, and it's Tiamat or the chaos salt water monster in Mesopotamian tradition. You overthrow the monster, and it is the monster's body that is then used to construct the cosmos. It's cool. Again, another analogy to the human experience, warfare. Uh, Instead of a war to end all wars, this was a war to begin all wars because now the cosmos exists, and everything unfolds from that. So what I'm saying is that Godzilla is not even just a post-World War II anxiety-driven image of a post-nuclear age in the form of a giant lizard. Chaotic sea monsters have been part of the human imagination forever, right? And there has to be a champion who arises to slay the cosmic sea monster, or at least defeat it. Uh, King Kong or Mothra or Owl Kitty. Uh, these stories are thousands of years old. And the monster keeps reappearing. In Christian tradition, it happens in the book of Revelations, where a giant sea monster with multiple heads comes out of the ocean and threatens to destroy everything. And God has to intervene and bring about the messianic times. So when you see sea monsters battling kitties or anything like that, it's a mythological echo of a very, very persistent mythological tradition about the battle between chaos and order. All right. So that brings us to Psalm 74, and we're going to be looking at verses 12 through 17. Why? Because even though our thinking is dominated by Genesis 1, the fact of the matter is the Bible preserves fragments of many different versions of God's creation of the world, and some of them overlap with Genesis, some of them not so much. And then, as you'll see, it echoes in later Jewish tradition. So let me read this for you. This is, I should tell you that you can see more about different versions of Israelite notions of how God created the world in Job 38. You can see it in Psalm 104 and right here in the middle of Psalm 74. And it does serve a function, even though I said that this was all about being threatened by enemies in the present. This has a relevancy to it because it's invoking the confidence that comes from a mythic tradition. All right. So 12. O God, my King of old, who brings deliverance throughout the land, it was you who drove back the sea with your might, who smashed the heads of the monsters in the waters. It was you who crushed the heads of Leviathan and left him as food for the denizens of the desert. It was you who released springs and torrents, who made mighty rivers run dry. The day is yours and the night also. It was you who set in place the orb of the sun, you who fixed the boundaries of the earth, summer and winter, you made them. All right. Now, let's talk about the immediate stuff there. There's a theomachy. There's God battling a monster. God has to slay Godzilla, just like King Kong. And what's going on here? It's kind of confusing, but it's actually the author is kind of intentionally uh, creating something convoluted. He's conflating things that we know with things that sound unusual to us. So let's look at it. You bring deliverance throughout the land. It was you who drove back the sea with your might. Now, if that sounds a little bit like the Exodus from Egypt, I think that's intentional. But remember, it's also like Genesis, right? Driving back the sea. How? I don't know. Well, because you smash the heads of the monsters in the water. In other words, you tame the sea by slaying its primordial chaotic nature, its spirit, its Godzilla. And this, again, echoes with the Canaanite tradition of Baal slaying Prince Yam, and it echoes with the Mesopotamian tradition of Marduk defeating uh, Tiamat. Here, however, it has its own name, and that name is Leviathan. That's the Hebrew name for the primordial chaos monster. So we have three words used here. Actually, we talk about the sea, which is to us is this very fluid, dynamic, but not a personality. But the reader in ancient times might have imagined it as a god. The sea is a god, like Prince Yam. And then it goes on and uses the word tanim, which also appears in Genesis 1, which is generally translated as sea monsters. Now we're talking in plural here. There's more than one. All right. And then it is you who crushed the heads of Leviathan, who left him for food to the denizens of the desert. Well, the denizens of the desert could be primordial animals, or it could be us making our way through the wilderness with the manna raining down on us. See what I mean about conflating images that are mythic with our sacred history in certain ways? Okay. So, anyway, God makes mighty rivers run dry. The day is yours. The night also refers to Genesis, separating the day from the night. So in some ways, this is very familiar. In some ways, this is very unfamiliar. Particularly the multiple thing. What do you mean multiple gods? Mostly it's one God. Well, there's two ways of thinking about this. Either one, we're talking about, I don't know, a hydra with multiple heads, or and a single body, or we're talking about multiple monsters. All right, like destroy all monsters, or one of those big show-offs where we've got Mothra and we've got Godzilla and we've got King Kong and we've got Mecha Godzilla, and they're all there fighting each other. Who knew that the Toho Studios would invoke such fundamental human emotions? But in any case, so I like to think it's a Hydra, that the sea monster, like the waves in the sea, has multiple heads. But it could also be multiple monsters. And in fact, that's how rabbinic tradition reads this. They believe they teach in their mythological version of this that there were two chaos monsters, a male one and a female one, two leviathans. And God slays one at the very beginning, the war to begin all wars, as it were. But the other one remains alive, which explains chaos in our world. Chaos, personified or abstract, is still here. Moral chaos, earthquakes, droughts, all the things that cause humans to suffer continue to happen, hopefully in a manageable form. All right, which is what brings us back to the rest of this poem. So we continue to endure chaos. We continue to be afflicted by forces beyond our control, But as the myth reminds us, God slew chaos once, God can do it again and will do it again. And in the rabbinic tradition, that is that the last remaining chaos monster will be slain and will be served as the fish course at the messianic banquet, right? Where you're going to have your choice of chicken, beef, or fish at the messianic banquet, and Leviathan the second is going to be the fish. Uh, Again, archly mythological. But what is the function of the myth? The function of the myth is to affirm to us that what happened in the past will happen in the future, that we may be afflicted by some form of chaos right now. But just as God slew chaos in the past, God will slay or tame chaos in the future. That what we're experiencing now, whether it be the destruction of the temple or the terrible attacks in Israel or the rise of anti Semitism, God will assure us that there will be a time when peace will be restored, when order will return, when life will get better. And that's the function of this myth in the Psalms, in the Hebrew Bible, and in the Jewish imagination. That what was past is future, and we can look forward to better times. So I happen to love the mythological, and I get a lot of spiritual pleasure out of them. I don't know if you do, but I love this. Um, You know, King Kong will triumph. Owl Kitty will defeat Godzilla once again, even if Godzilla comes back in a later movie. And that's us. It's our franchise. It's our movie franchise. Chaos comes, disrupts us, destroys us, but never completely. And we will overcome it because God is with us. So I'm going to stop there. I think that's more than enough, but you get my point. So do not lose confidence in the future. Uh, Chaos will be defeated once again until at the very end it is defeated utterly. Thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next week.